Hello everyone, welcome to Tech Tutorials. In this series, we will talk about reusable components. We will create some components that we use a lot during our actual development of a project and hope it will work for you. So in this part, we will talk about React Hook Form. We will show you how to install it, and we will create a HOC with this React Hook form. So whenever you want to create a form, you don't have to do a lot of stuff again and again. You just do it once, and then you can use it for other forms. So let's do that. Okay, let's show a little bit of React Hook form first, and you'll see some values around this package. Then we can go over the demo of our application. So basically, these are the forms. These are the sample form that you can have on your application. I added some fields for it, and then you'll see that there's some interesting states. For example, it is watching for any change, it is watching for any error, and it is saying that which form has touched, which field has touched. So if I just try typing, you will see that this value is changing here. And then if I have some errors, like if I go to email address and I try something that doesn't have the email format, as you can see, this will show up here. And it says that there's some error around that. And I can just check the check mark. I will see the value is changing here. And if I have some drop down, it gets the drop down value and so on and so forth. So as soon as I try to submit, it is saying that there are some required fields that we need to fill out, and it is still showing that which fields are touched. So this is the library that we are trying to use. And now how we can integrate it with our React application. In order to make it simple, I just use one field, but during the next tutorials, I'll add more fields like the one we had here. We can add a date picker, we can add a select form, I will add a radio checkbox, but for now, for the simplicity, I added only one field. So as soon as I start typing, and one more thing before going there, you see that this first name from the placeholder, it goes to the label. So this is also something that we can use in react-bootstrap. I'll talk about it. But as soon as I try to type, I'll type, for example, Huckstack as a name. And if I submit it, you'll see that inside of the console, it gets the submitted value. That's all this application is doing. And if you see that if I added empty field, as soon as I make it empty, it shows the error that this field is required. So it's basically binding the form with the element and with the submit. That's all we're trying to do, and it gets more complicated as we go forward. Okay, I'll take a different approach for this tutorial and maybe this series, and I will pre-type all of the code that we need for this section, and I'll just explain each part of the code one by one. And you can just let me know if this way is better. And during the tutorial, the structure of the code is also open, and you can see which file is located where. So if you have watched the tutorials for React that we had before, which is a prerequisite for this series, is you know that how to create the React with TypeScript and have something up. So the structure that we have is very simple. It's just src folder, and we have components and Redux. In Redux, we have the store file, and components, we have one profile page and one shared component. And in shared component, we defined some input field that we use a lot. So we created some common input field, and we have some HOC. If you have not watched HOC component and what is HOC, you can just go back and watch the previous tutorials that we have. In advanced tutorial, I think we have HOC component. We described it in full explanation. So we have some HOC that every time we have a form, we don't need to add most of the code. We just add the fields, and it will work as we expected. So this is the basic structure of the code. I will go over each file individually, but just to let you know that this is the structure of the code. The first step for using React hook form is to install the package. So you just, in your terminal, you type react hook form, in npm install react hook form, and whatever version that it's currently, they're using 7.41.3, and you can install it. And if I go to the app TSX that we have, you will see that it's very simple. We're using React Router DOM. If you have not watched the React Router DOM, you can go back and watch that tutorial, how we implement it. But we have only one path, which is profile page, which we defined inside of our profile here in the component profile page. So I added this route here, and that's it for the app TSX. If I go to the profile page, it's again a simple component. I can just close this one. It's a very simple, that's the part that it's doing the console. When we submit the form, this callback function is getting called and it prints the form data on the console. And inside of this profile page, we have a form. That's the form that we are going to implement. And where is this personal info form? You can see it inside of the this folder, personal info form. And if I go inside of this personal info form, you'll see some elements. I will talk about this element, but basically let's focus on this part only. It's called floating input field. That's the component that I added. So what does it do? First, let's go to the bootstrap and let's see. It's the one that I talked that it changes the placeholder to label. So as soon as you click inside, it removes the placeholder and make it a label here. So this way you save some spaces, especially for the mobile development, that you don't need to have a label on top and a placeholder. So it moves the placeholder as a label on top. So that's the component that we're using for Bootstrap, and the component name is floating label. So for here, I called it floating input field and I customized it. Basically, it accepts some parameters. We'll talk about all of these parameters, just don't focus it right now. And then it will return the component that is more customized. And I can show it to you. So basically, this is the floating label that we saw on this example. It's the floating example. It gets some properties, label and class name. So I add the label. It gets its label from the props of the parent component, and I wrapped it with form group. If you worked with React Bootstrap, you know that each form group you can just wrap it with form group, and that's all it does here. So you can add a class name and it adds some minor styling around it. And on top of it, I also, user can pass some class names into this component, so it will be applied to this component. That's other property that we are using here. Also, the other property that I added is that if you want to pass some property into floating label, there's a property for that as well. All of them are optional. So if I go to the types, and these are the properties that this component accepts. And as you can see, all of them mostly are optional. I added just in case. If you want to add the class name here, you can just pass it to the component and it will take it. And also, this is basically the input value that we see on the screen. And this input value also gets some properties. So I set all of the properties based on the props that we pass into this component. So if it's, for example, the value, if we have the value, we set it. If this value is required, we can just set it here. This input value can also have a class name. So if they want to apply some class name, they can add it here. They can define a type of this input. Sometimes the type of input is password, for example, so you want to cover it, or sometimes it's text or something else, or email, or whatever type that it is, they can just pass this type into the component. By default, we have it here. If they pass the type, we can just use the type, but if they have not passed it, we can just use text, and we assume that this is the text. Same thing for placeholder. If we see that we have a placeholder for it, we use the placeholder, but if we don't see the placeholder, we can just use the label as the placeholder. This is for the time that you want to have a different placeholder other than the label. So same here. So that's why we have a different variable instead of the, because it has some calculation, I would say. So added here. And if they pass some properties to the form, so we just pass it here. So this, I can show you these types here. This is form control props. So for example, you have some props that you want to pass it to this component and just apply it to the input field. You can just use this property to do that. It has a lot of properties that are optional, and you can use it or leave it as is. The only required one is the label, that you need to provide the label for this input props. And the last property that I defined for here is the error message. So if you want to have some error message, you can just provide the error message to this prop and it will show it to you. So basically, this is some small component that you can pass these parameters into it, and it will return basically to the view the ones that you required. So that's all it does in this personal. So as you can see, I passed few parameters. I didn't pass all of the parameters that are optional. I just passed that I want to have this property, this field to be required. The label that I want to pass is first name, and there are some props that I want to be applied on the form control. We will talk about why we need to pass these props, but I'm passing some properties to the field in order to be applied at this level. So this is the part that it applies all of my parameters. And at the end, I just also provide the error message that I like if there are some errors on the screen. Okay, let's recap again. We have a profile page here that in profile page we have a simple component that we added, personal info form. And if I go to personal info form, I see that we use again a custom component, which is floating input field, which we defined for our application. If I go to floating input field, you'll see that I use some react-bootstrap data. So these form group, floating label, form control, all of these are the components of react-bootstrap. If you have not watched react-bootstrap tutorial, you can go there and watch it. But that's all for this component, and we can just use this component inside of our personal info form that we defined. The things that we need to define here, and we have not talked about it, is the HOC component. If you're not familiar with HOC, you can go and watch the HOC tutorial, but we define a withForm HOC here that it will do most of the actions or most of the codes that we might duplicate for a different form for us. So next time I want to add a new form, I can just use this withForm and it will do all of the required things and bind everything together for me for adding a new form without writing a lot of code. So that's the other part that we used here. So we wrapped our component with withForm, and this HOC requires one more elements or arguments, which is elements. So what are elements? Basically all of the elements that we have on the screen. So right now there is only one element on the screen, which is first name. And what we pass here inside of this field, we pass the name of the element, an initial value of this element, and if it's required or not. That's all we need to pass for our element. And that's basically it for this component. The other things that we have not talked a lot is the form control props. So in the documentation of the React form hooks, React hook form, in order to define some rules for your field, in order to validate it, you have to pass this register. So you pass the register, and the first argument of register is the name of the field, and the next argument you can pass the rules. So if I go to the documentation, you will see that it's exactly what they are suggesting. For example, it's the register, the name of the element, and the rules. For us, we just defined that it needs to be required, and the max length for us, I think it's 80 characters. But for them, they defined, I would say they should name this one email. But yeah, the email, or no, the name, this is the name. But for email, you can just define a pattern. For example, the name should not have numbers. That's what this regex is saying. Or for age, we have a different rule. The minimum should be 18, maximum should be 99. These are the rules that you can define as part of the register. And that's why I have a register function, and I define only one rule, basically two rules, which is first required and max length. And that's why we pass this props into our floating input field, and it will pass the register right here. Since we have this parameter passing to this component, it will add it to this field, which is suggested in the documentation. So since we want to apply it in the input field itself, we need to pass it to the input field, which will be this form control. So these are the parameters that we are passing for React hook form. And we get these parameters basically from where? From the HOC. So there are some props that is passing to this. As you can see, this is a prop, and we get the register and the error. So we can get error and the register from the HOC. So we'll talk about how we get these from the props, but for now you can just see when we get it from the HOC, we will just pass it to our component. Okay, we said that we have a HOC, that we are using it here. We wrapped our component with this HOC, and we pass two arguments. The first argument for sure should be our component, and the second argument I defined it, and this is the elements that we are passing into our HOC. And from HOC we receive some props that we listed here, and we are using these props inside of the component itself. But now let's go through the HOC and see what we have in the HOC. So the definition of HOC is that it's a component that returns a component, a function that returns a component. In HOC tutorial, we had HOC that was a class component, but this one I tried to be functional component and use the functional component here. So basically, if you see the structured one and ignore these types, these are just types, nothing else. Since we are using TypeScript, I just use types here. I define some types here, so nothing too fancy. But for HOC, as you can see, we define one HOC here, which is withForm, and it takes a component and it returns a component. So that's a functional component. So if I go inside of it, and the rest, as you can see, it gets a wrapper component and the elements. These are the two parameters that we were passing right here. So as you can see, it gets two parameters. First one, the component, the second one, the elements. These are the two arguments. The first one, component, and the elements. And then let's see what it's doing with it. So what does it return? It returns another component, some props. So if you ignore these parts, just ignore it for now. We'll go over them after I describe the form itself. So let's ignore these parts and just focus on the return part. So if we just focus on this part. So what does it return? Let's look at it. So first of all, it's wrapping it with a form, bootstrap form. So this is the component that Bootstrap makes it available for us. And then it adds the component that itself that we are sending inside of it. For example, we are passing this personal info form into it. So basically it takes this part and adds it instead of this. So if I just want to say, it will just basically replace this part with this when we run it. I just want to revert what we did. And now these are the parameters or props that I was saying that we need to pass inside of our component. So currently we are passing register and errors from the React form hooks. So these are the two parameters that we had here, and that's how we provide it here as well. So we pass these two parameters into it. And the next one is the submit button. Basically, this is the class name for submit button. The variant is the way that it look. Basically, when you have primary, it will look like blue button. And the type of a button, since it's a submit button, we can just type it submit. And on click handler, we have this very simple boolean that we are setting true or false. And what does it do? What does it do basically? Initially, when we run the form, it is not validating. So if I just run the form, since it's empty, if it stays empty, and if I just don't submit it, it does not validate it. As you can see, it's empty, but it's not validating. Why it's not validating? First, because I passed this no validate, and second, because this should validate is false by default. So this should validate is using a use state. So this use state is React hook functions that you can use. If you are not familiar with React hooks, you should go back and watch the React hook tutorial. But basically we have a simple state that we can turn this validate true or false for our form, and I just turn it true when they submit the form. When they have not submitted the form, I am not taking it true. So that's why even if it's empty, you don't see error, but as soon as you submit and then make it empty, then you will see the error. And it's because this boolean becomes true. And that's all for the form. And we have also on submit. Basically, it submits the form and it handles the submit that we have for React hook form. So let's go over the props that we have here. So if I start from the top, you'll see that one const that is called elements with initial values. If you remember from here, personal info form, we were passing the elements, and each element should have some initial value. So this is basically the initial value for each field. So we define an empty object here, and we will pass the initial values inside of for each element, and that's all we are doing here. and this is the same elements that we passed to the HOC, and I do the for each loop to add initial value for each element. So basically it initializes it with, for example here, empty string. And then I get all of these props from useForm hook of React hook form. As you can see, React hook form has a hook called useForm, and I use this form to get this property, the register, handle, submit, form state errors. These are the things that they mentioned in the documentation, that you can use useForm to get the register and handle, submit, and as extra I get the errors as well. So basically these are the things that you get and pass it to our component, register and errors. That's how you can get these errors. And at the very last, on submit, we're doing very simple thing here. We are basically passing to the parent component that we have, and the user has submitted the form. So this props is a callback function that we defined inside of our profile page. So this form submitted callback, so that's the same props that we have here. So when they submit, we pass all of the data and we send it back. That was all for this with form, and it is very handy, not only for one form, because currently we have only one form associated with it, but when we have multiple forms, you don't need to write all of these codes again for the next form. You just have to create a new file and add whatever element that you want to put for your form. In next tutorials, we will talk about adding a different types of inputs, like select, like checkboxes, and then later we will integrate it with some database services and make it a little bit more interesting and more look like a real application in industry. So that was all. Let me know if this way of introducing or tutorial way is working better for you, so I don't have to write the code. I just explain the code and you can just see and watch it, and avoiding some keyboard noise when during the tutorials.